The river crossing cost her the last of what she had. Verity counted the coins twice before handing them over, as if counting might somehow make them multiply. They didn't. The ferryman took the money without looking at her face, and the flat-bottomed barge groaned its way across the Fraser toward the settlement of Coldwater Landing, which was nothing more than a cluster of rough-hewn buildings hammered into the slope of the valley like afterthoughts. She had come from Halifax, 5 weeks by train and stage, and finally this slow drift across a brown river that smelled of snowmelt and pine mud. She had a letter in her coat pocket, written in a careful, looping hand. "You will find Coldwater Landing a place of great opportunity. I am in need of a woman of practical skills. Come west and we will discuss arrangements." Signed by 1R Colby. She had believed it because she had wanted to. That was the only honest explanation she could give herself, standing on the Coldwater dock with her trunk and her kit bag and her empty purse, watching the ferryman pole back to the other side. R. Colby turned out to be a heavy-set man with a merchant's suit and a merchant's eyes, the kind that assessed rather than looked. He came down to the landing with his thumbs in his vest pockets and stopped 3 feet short of her, taking her in the way a man appraises livestock he suspects has been misrepresented. She was 31. She knew what she looked like. Angular jaw, practical braid, hands that had been in a birthing room far too often to pass as delicate. She had spent 6 years as the closest thing Dartmouth County had to a trained midwife, until the Provincial Medical Board decided that what she was doing constituted the unlicensed practice of medicine. The fine had taken her savings. The shame had taken the rest. So she had come west, because west was what you did when you ran out of east. "You're older than I expected," Colby said. "You're smaller than your letter suggested," Verity replied. His expression closed like a shutter. He looked at her kit bag, the one with the glass vials and the dried herbs and the worn midwifery manual she had memorized in her early 20s. He looked at the set of her shoulders. "The arrangement I had in mind," he said carefully, "requires a woman of a more domestic disposition, someone agreeable. I'm agreeable when I've been agreed with. You see, that's exactly." He stopped, pulled a breath through his nose. "The letter I sent was perhaps too broad in its description. I was looking for a wife, miss, not a physician. I'm not a physician. The board made that very clear." Regardless. He took 1 step back, which managed to be both a retreat and a dismissal. "I don't believe we suit. I'll ensure your trunk is moved off the dock before the afternoon freight comes in. The boarding house on the main road doesn't take charity, but the church opens its hall on Tuesdays." He turned and walked away up the hill without a second look. Just like that, as if she were a parcel with the wrong address that someone else would deal with. Verity stood on the dock. The river moved past her, indifferent and cold. She had 7 cents in her coat lining, stitched there in case of emergency, and this qualified. The dock cleared slowly as the afternoon wore on. Pack horses were loaded and led up the hill. Men came and went with purpose she didn't share. She sat on her trunk and watched the mountains to the northwest, enormous blue-gray and utterly uninterested in her situation. "Colby." The voice came from behind her, low, flat, the texture of gravel under boot leather. She turned. The man standing at the edge of the dock didn't look like he belonged in the settlement. He looked like the mountains had sent him down as a representative. Large in the way that had nothing to do with bulk. The kind of size that came from years of hauling timber and fighting weather. A dark, close-cropped beard, coat stained with pine pitch, and eyes that were an unsettling shade of grey-green, like river water over stone. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the hill. Colby had disappeared up. "He walked away from you," the man said. "Not a question." "He did." He looked at her then, briefly and completely, the way you'd look at a trail to assess whether it was passable. Not unkind, not particularly warm either. "You've got medical training," I've got practical experience and a government fine to prove they didn't like it. The faintest crease appeared at the corner of his eye. It might have been a suppressed smile. My name's Leith. I run cattle up on the Coldwater bench, 14 miles north of here. He said it the way you'd state a geographic fact. I've got a boy, 7 years old. He stopped talking 8 months ago. Fever took his mother in November and he hasn't said a word since. The doctor from the valley came up twice and said there was nothing physically wrong, said to give it time. Something shifted in his face. A heaviness that had clearly settled in and made itself permanent. Time doesn't seem to be doing much. Verity looked at him steadily. What are you offering? A room, meals, a wage at the end of each month, reasonable rates. You'd keep the house, help with the cooking, and spend time with the boy. He picked up her trunk, easily, the way you'd lift a sack of seed. If you've got the patience for a child who won't answer back, you might be the only kind of stubborn that work on him. You don't know anything about me. I know Colby turned you away and you didn't cry about it. He looked at the kit bag. And I know you carried that thing across the country, which means whatever's in it matters to you. A woman who handles her tools that carefully isn't the kind who quits when things get hard. He set the trunk in the bed of a battered wagon, hitched to 2 large roans. That's all I need to know right now. Verity looked at the boarding house up the hill, looked at the church further along, looked at her 7 cents. She picked up the kit bag and walked to the wagon. She didn't ask for help getting up. She grabbed the wheels, spoke, and the cider rail and hauled herself onto the bench, her boot slipping once in the mud before she found purchase. Leith climbed up from the other side and picked up the reins without comment. They drove out of Coldwater Landing as the sun began to slide behind the peaks. The road north was a suggestion more than a road, 2 ruts through spruce and alder that climbed steadily as the valley narrowed. The air grew colder, thinner. Verity had a wool coat, but it wasn't a mountain coat, and she sat rigid against the bite of it, refusing to shiver. Leith reached behind the bench, without looking at her, and dropped a heavy canvas work jacket across her lap. Wrap up, he said. The bench doesn't care how tough you are. She put it on. It smelled like wood smoke and horse and something faintly medicinal. Spruce gum, she thought, or pine tar. It swallowed her whole. She didn't care. Tell me about the boy, she said. Leith was quiet for a moment. The horses picked their way around a section of washout. He was a talker, Leith said finally. Before, couldn't shut him up from sunup to dark. He'd narrate everything he did, like he thought you needed a running account of his movements. A pause, and then Celia died, and it just. He turned a rein in his hands, stopped. Did anyone explain it to him, why she died? I tried. The word came out clipped. I'm not good at explaining things I don't understand myself. He looked straight ahead. I can fell a timber without it crushing me. I can find water in August when the creek's dried up. I can't explain to a 7-year-old why his mother isn't coming back. Verity looked at his profile, sharp against the dimming sky. She recognized the shape of what he was carrying. She'd seen it in widowers before, in bereaved fathers. The guilt of the survivor. The particular agony of feeling incompetent at grief. What does he do when he's not talking? Does he play? He watches things, animals mostly. He'll sit at the edge of the tree line for an hour watching a squirrel. Doesn't fidget, doesn't make noise. A pause. It's unnatural quiet for a child that age. It might be the only control he has left, Verity said, more to the darkening air ahead than to Leith. When everything else breaks apart, you hold on to the one thing nobody can take from you. He didn't answer, but she felt him look at her, briefly, before turning back to the trail. The homestead appeared in the last grey light, a low-roofed log house in a clearing. Ringed by spruce, with a barn built solid and a kitchen garden that had gone entirely to weeds, the kind of place that had been carefully made and badly maintained which told her everything about what the past 8 months had been. The front door opened before the wagon stopped. Owen stood on the step, small for 7, dark-haired, with his father's grey-green eyes set in a pale, watchful face. He looked at the wagon, looked at Verity. He didn't retreat inside, but he didn't come forward either. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, assessing. Verity climbed down from the wagon. She didn't crouch to his eye level. She didn't offer a wide, false smile. "I'm Verity," she said. "I'll be staying here." Owen's eyes tracked to the kit bag, the brass clasp, the worn leather strap. "There are bottles in there," she said, "and dried plants, some seeds. You can look at them if you want, once we're inside." She walked past him through the door. "But not before supper. What's left to eat in this kitchen, I wonder?" She heard small feet on the step behind her as she crossed the threshold. The inside of the cabin was a study in functional collapse. The table was buried under trapping gear and harness straps. The iron stove had a crust of old grease on its top. There were, she noted, 2 tin cups on the shelf rather than 3. Someone had quietly removed the third one. She found potatoes in the root cellar, salt pork in the barrel, dried onions hanging from a ceiling beam. She set water to boil and began. Owen sat in the corner by the stove on a worn wooden stool that was clearly his, judging by the grease stains and the small notch in the seat. He watched her. He didn't speak, but when she asked him, not turning around, speaking to the pot on the stove. "There's a cast iron ladle somewhere in this kitchen. Where do people keep things around here?" She heard the stool scrape and a small hand reached past her to open the lower cabinet and point. "Thank you," she said, and kept stirring. Leith came in from the barn after dark. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the cleared table, the lit lamp, the smell of something hot. He sat down without a word. They ate. Owen finished his whole bowl, which Verity noted Leith, watching, with an expression he was doing his best to keep neutral. She washed the dishes. Leith put Owen to bed. She heard one low voice, and silence from the back room, and something about that lopsided sound made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. She was not here to mother anyone, she reminded herself. She was here because she had 7 cents, and nowhere else to go. The first 2 weeks were a careful war, though Owen fought it differently than she expected. He didn't sabotage or rebel. He just watched her from his corner, from the garden fence, from the top of the root cellar steps. He was measuring her the way his father measured her, assessing whether she would hold or break. She talked to him the way she would talk to someone who chose not to answer, which was differently from someone who couldn't. She didn't pepper him with questions. She narrated what she was doing. "I'm pressing these yarrow stems because they'll need to be dry before the cold sets in. This knot is called a clove hitch. It won't slip, but it'll release fast if you need it." And let the words fall without demanding. He opened up to catch them. On the 9th day, she was in the kitchen garden, trying to salvage what remained of the herb patch, pulling strangling grass from around a determined stand of sage. The roots were deep and she'd been at it, long enough for her knuckles to be gritty and scraped. She heard Owen behind her. He'd been shadowing her all morning. She kept working without turning. After a long moment he crouched beside her and began pulling grass from around the next clump of sage, unhurried, precise, the way he did everything. "Your mother planted these," Verity said, not a question. Owen pulled another handful of grass. His jaw tightened. "She knew what she was doing," Verity said. "Sage this close to the kitchen door is exactly right, keeps the mice off, smells good when you cook with the door open." She sat back on her heels and looked at the ragged little garden. "We can save it if we're careful. Things that look dead aren't always." Owen looked at her then, really looked at her, not the measuring assessment, but something direct and fragile and very young. Then he looked back down and kept pulling grass. He stayed beside her the rest of the afternoon. That was enough. Leith watched from the barn door. He didn't say anything at supper. But the next morning, there was a fresh cord of split wood stacked beside the kitchen door that hadn't been there the night before. She understood. He was a man who expressed things in wood and water and practical provision. She had learned to read that language. October brought the cold down from the peaks in a rush, and with it came the sickness. It started in Owen's chest, a wet, rattling cough that woke Verity at 3 a.m, because she had heard that sound enough times to know it didn't fix itself. She built the fire, made a light, and went to check him. He was burning, not dangerously, not yet, but climbing. She went through her kit systematically. Elderflower, thyme oil, rendered tallow for a chest rub. She had what she needed for mild fever. What she needed for the cough that could drop into the lungs and become pneumonia was in the small, locked cedar box on the shelf above Leith's bed. She'd seen it her first day. Hadn't touched it. She'd known what it was without being told. She knocked on the door to the loft. Leith. He was up and down the stairs in seconds, belt not yet buckled, reading her face the way he read weather. Chest cough, she said quietly, keeping her voice steady so he could. Fever's climbing. I have basics but the better medicines. She looked toward the loft stairs. There's a cedar box up there. I think it was Celia's. I need to know what's in it. The stillness that came over him was the same kind she'd seen in the yard that first week. Not peace, but its opposite. Something held very, very tight. Leith, her voice was not unkind, but it was firm. I'm not asking to take her things. I'm asking you to help me help your son. He moved past her, up the stairs. She heard the box open. He came back down, carrying it in both arms, setting it on the table with a care that made clear what it cost him. I don't know what's in it, he said. She ordered things from the catalogue. I never asked. Verity opened it. Camphor, dried boneset, a small brown bottle of laudanum, old. She'd use it carefully. Mustard powder, and a folded piece of paper in handwriting she recognized as a woman's, careful and thorough for the cold months. Keep Owen's feet warm first. He chills from the feet up. Verity read the note twice. Leith was staring at the box, his hands pressed flat on the table, tendons showing across his knuckles. She left instructions, Verity said softly. He turned away, went to the window and put his back to her. She let him. She took what she needed from the box, made a mustard plaster, brewed the bone set, found a pair of thick wool socks that must have been Celia's because they were small and far too carefully knitted to be work socks, and put them on Owen's feet. Then she sat in the chair, beside his bed, and kept watch. Around 4 a.m, Leith came in and sat in the other chair without asking. They didn't speak. They just sat, one on either side, while Owen's breathing slowly evened out. By morning the fever had broken. The cedar box stayed on the table. Leith didn't put it back. Within a week its contents had become working medicine, used carefully, replaced where she could, catalogued in the small notebook she kept. Leith watched her work with the same expression Owen had worn in the garden, not suspicious, just assessing. He started lingering at the kitchen table after supper, rather than going straight to the loft. He fixed the hinge on the root cellar door without being asked. Once, coming in from the woodpile, she found him reading her midwifery manual where she'd left it on the table, and he set it down with the unhurried dignity of a man who had not been caught doing anything worth noting. Owen was getting better, not suddenly, not all at once. But he had started leaving small things for her to find, a smooth river stone on the windowsill, a cluster of dried seed pods, and once a drawing on a scrap of paper. 2 figures, one tall and one small, both looking at something off the right edge of the page. She put it in her kit bag without comment, and didn't mention it. March arrived without announcement. One morning the sound of the melt was everywhere, dripping from the eaves, running in the ruts of the yard, the creek coming back to voice below the tree line, the mountain exhaling. Owen had started following her to the door each morning when she went out to check the sky. He would stand beside her, not touching, and look at the same piece of it. She had learned his language. Proximity meant approval. Stillness meant thought, and the particular way he tilted his head to one side meant he was about to show her something. On the first clear morning of March, he tilted his head. She waited. He pointed to the eaves, where two grey jays had rebuilt something over the winter and were now arguing about the revisions. They come back to the same place every year, Verity said. Even when it doesn't look like much is left, they know what's underneath. Owen looked at her, the direct, fragile look again, the one that showed his age. His mouth moved. She kept her eyes on the birds. She did not hold her breath. Mum liked them, Owen said. His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper, a small and enormous sound against the spring morning. Verity looked at the grey jays. She had good taste, she said. Owen leaned, very slightly, so that his shoulder was against her arm. She didn't move. She didn't tell Leith directly. She let him find out on his own. That evening he came in from the barn, and Owen looked up from the fire and said, "The jays are back," in that same rough whisper. Leith stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment. Then he sat down heavily in his chair and put his forearm across his eyes. He stayed like that for half a minute. Owen watched him, and then went back to poking the fire, which was, Verity had come to understand, the most tactful thing this particular child knew how to do. Leith's arm came down. His eyes were red at the rims. He looked at Verity across the table. She looked back. "Thank you," he said, 2 words carrying the weight of 8 months. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "He's going to want to talk all the time now. You should prepare yourself." Something broke open in Leith's face, quiet and private, and became a smile. It was the first time she'd seen it. It stripped away the weathered severity and showed her who he must have been before grief had set like concrete around him. She looked back at the pot on the stove before he could see what the sight of it did to her. April came in soft and wet. Leith made the first supply run down to Coldwater Landing, taking the wagon before dawn. He was gone 2 days. The cabin was too large without him. Verity scrubbed the floor with more force than the floor deserved. Owen sensed the shift and stayed close, which helped and didn't help in equal measure. On the second evening, just as the sun dropped behind the ridge and painted the sky in streaks of bruised purple and orange, the grinding rumble of wagon wheels came through the trees. Verity stepped onto the porch. She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. Her heart was doing something undignified against her sternum, but she kept her face entirely still. Leith pulled the team into the yard. The wagon held sacks of grain, a new iron plowshare, crates of supplies. He wrapped the reins around the brake and climbed down. He was covered in road dust and looked tired in the way that comes from thinking too hard for too long. He didn't unload the wagon. He walked straight up the steps and onto the porch and stopped 2 feet in front of her. He reached into his coat and held out a leather packet. "There's money in there," he said. His eyes were on the ridge, not her face. Cattle prices were good this winter. "It's more than wages, enough to get you back east, or somewhere better. There are hospitals in Victoria now. They're taking women with practical experience. You could have a real position." He paused. "You shouldn't have to take on another winter up here. You've done what you came to do." Verity looked at the packet. She thought of Halifax. She thought of the Provincial Medical Board. She thought of Colby's eyes at the Coldwater dock, flat and calculating, and the particular silence of the ferry ride away from everything she had known. She looked at the packet and felt nothing she expected to feel. "Leave it on the table," she said. Leith frowned, but he walked past her inside and dropped the packet on the table with a heavy thud. She followed him in and closed the door. Owen was by the fire, very still, holding his breath in the way of a child, pretending to tend a fire, while in fact listening to every single word. Verity walked to the table, opened the packet, counted it without expression. It was a great deal of money, enough for a proper life, a civilized life. Floors that didn't heave in January and pipes that didn't freeze. She looked up at Leith. "You said if I wanted to leave in the spring, you'd provide the means," she said. "I did. I don't recall saying I wanted to leave." "You don't have to want to." His jaw tightened. "I'm not trying to drive you off. I'm trying to give you an actual choice. You came here because Colby left you on that dock with nothing. Not because you chose this. You deserve to choose now, properly, with options in front of you." "Leith." She set her hand flat on the table. "Are you doing something decent for me? Or are you making it easier to watch me go? Because those are two different things, and I want to know which one this is before I decide what to do with your money." He went very still. The fire crackled. Outside, the melt dripped steadily from the eaves. Leith looked at her. For once, he didn't look at the ridge, or the floor, or the middle distance. He looked straight at her, and she could see him fighting the thing that had been living behind his ribs since November, fighting it the way you fight a current, with everything you have, and losing ground. "I know what it costs," he said, his voice low and stripped of anything careful. "Living up here, I watched Celia." He stopped, swallowed. She never complained, but I knew. The winters, the isolation, the medicine that couldn't get up here fast enough. His hands were tight at his sides. "I can't ask you to take that on. Not after everything you've already." "You're not asking," Verity said. "That's the entire problem. You keep deciding what I can and can't withstand without consulting me." She pushed the money to the center of the table. "I was trained in a county with no roads and no hospital within 40 miles. I have delivered babies in January in houses with no heat and no light. I have been cold before, Leith. I am not breakable." "I know you're not breakable." His voice cracked on it. "That's not what I—" "Then what is it?" She stepped closer. "Say it plainly. I need plainly. I am not standing here through another winter not knowing where I stand." Leith looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the table, at Owen's very careful stillness by the fire, at the cedar box that was now simply the medicine cabinet, and had been for months. Then he looked at Verity. "I don't want you to go," he said. The words were quiet and plain and cost him visibly. "I want you to stay. I've wanted you to stay since January, and I knew I had no right to say it, and I may still not, but I don't want you to go." The fire popped. Verity reached out and pushed the packet the rest of the way across the table until it was sitting in front of him. "Then buy something useful with that," she said. "The root cellar door still doesn't hang right, and I want glass for the south window so I can start seeds in February." Leith's breath came out of him in a long, slow exhale, the sound of a thing held too long finally set down. He reached across the table. He covered her hand with his, rough, scarred and warm, and held on. "Verity," said Owen from the fire. He didn't turn around. His voice was small and very matter-of-fact. "Will you stay?" Verity looked at the back of the small dark head, at the fire, at the cedar box on the shelf and the grey jays in the eaves, and the enormous April dark, pressing gently at the windows. "Yes," she said, "I'll stay." Owen went back to tending the fire with the satisfied air of someone had achieved a thing through great patience and not inconsiderable strategy. Leith looked down at their joined hands on the table, and when he looked up, there was something in his face that had no precise name, only that it looked like a man who had finally come back from wherever grief had taken him and found, against all reasonable expectation, that something was still standing. Verity had come to Coldwater Landing with 7 stitched cents, a kit bag, and a letter that turned out to be nothing. She had found a mountain bench, a child who needed time to speak, and a man who needed time to tell the truth. She had found, without planning to, the right kind of work, in the right kind of quiet. and someone who thought her stubbornness was a feature rather than a flaw. The frontier does not offer softness, it offers something harder and longer lasting. The slow, unglamorous truth that some things are built one day at a time, in cold kitchens and weed-choked gardens and rooms where people sit together in silence and understand each other anyway. If these mountains, these voices, this particular kind of stubborn, kept you here until the last word, then leave us a comment below and tell us which moment stayed with you. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it and come back to Mountain Hollow. We'll keep the fire burning.